If you're serious about landing brand deals and sponsors, well, you need your contracts. You need them ready to send out, not just a mental list of terms that you'd compare the paperwork against if it ever showed up. No, here's why that distinction matters. A creator I will call Jamie had been chasing sponsors for months, and it finally paid off. A mid-sized brand loved the pitch and wrote back, "Great, go ahead, send over your standard agreement, and we'll get this moving." So Jamie stared at that line for a while. There was no standard agreement. Every deal Jamie had ever done, it had been the brand's paperwork. Jamie signed whatever showed up. Nothing had ever needed to go in that other direction. So Jamie spent the next several days trying to piece together a sponsorship contract from scratch and cobbled together language from old emails and guessed at terms and hoped that nothing important got left out. And by the time something usable finally went back to the brand, well, the momentum from that early enthusiastic, "yeah, let's do it," had cooled considerably. Now, if you're pitching sponsors right now, or you're about to start pitching, this is exactly the moment you should ask yourself whether you could do the same thing Jamie couldn't. Send out your own agreement template today if a brand asked for it. Hi there, and welcome back. I'm Gordon Firemark, the podcast lawyer, and this is Legit Podcast Pro, the show that helps creators build businesses that are worth building. Not just content that's worth watching, but businesses worth building. Now, today, we're talking about the contracts that every creator business needs before it starts chasing sponsors, not after. Now, most of the advice out there about landing brand deals is really about the pitch. Your media kit, your numbers, your outreach email. And look, that stuff does matter, absolutely. But nobody tells you that one of the things most likely to slow down or sink a deal altogether isn't your pitch, it's what's missing behind the scenes. Think about what's actually happening. When you're getting ready to pitch sponsors, you're thinking outwardly. You're right. How do I look credible? How do I look professional? How do I get noticed? What you're probably not thinking about is what's happening the moment a brand says yes and expects you to now act like a business that does this regularly. That's when the gaps start to show up. Not gaps in the content. These are gaps in your business, in your processes, in your systems. And if you've got a co-host or a co-producer, an editor, anyone else who has hands on the show, this gets even more urgent, not less. Because being a sponsor isn't just evaluating you, they're evaluating whether the show itself is a stable thing to land money with, to hand the money over to. If two people can't agree on how a check gets split, well, that's not a private matter anymore. That's the sponsor's problem too. And sponsors don't like to be or have those kinds of problems. And I'll say this from experience, not theory. In over 3 decades of practicing entertainment and media law, helping creators just like you, I have never once seen a deal fall apart because the creator's numbers weren't good enough. What I have seen is plenty fall apart or stall or get awkward because of exactly the kinds of gaps that I'm talking about here today. This is exactly what I'm about. I built the Creator Business Protection Blueprint to help creators find a way to see in one place what you've actually got locked down and what is still handshake and hope. If you're actively pitching brands or about to be, it's worth taking 10 minutes. Find the blueprint at gordonfiremark.com/blueprint. Check it out, get on the list, and learn more. All right, so let's talk about what sponsor ready actually requires on paper, not just in theory or on camera. There are 3 things that I think you need to have in place, not because I'm a lawyer and I told you to, but because each of these solves a specific, predictable problem that shows up right when you least want it in the middle of a deal that you're excited about. First up, an agreement with anyone else who has a stake in your show. Your co-host, your business partner, your co-producer, whoever shares ownership or decision-making responsibility. Here's the question this agreement answers. When sponsorship money comes in, who decides how it's split? And who's actually responsible for delivering what the sponsor has promised? Now, that sounds obvious till you're the one negotiating it in real time under a deadline when there's a deal on the table and a disagreeable teammate you got to work it out with. Now, I've seen this play out with shows that split everything 50-50 on the surface. Same credit, same visibility, But one person's doing most of the work, most of the editing. The other does most of the outreach. And nobody ever wrote down what happens when sponsorship revenue starts to flow in instead of just listener goodwill. Everything's fine when there's no money, but the moment there is, it stops being quite so fine. Now, some people call this kind of an agreement a podcast prenup. And honestly, that's not a bad way to think about it. You're not writing it because you expect things to go wrong. You're writing it so that if a disagreement ever does show up, you're not inventing the rules from scratch while brands or others are waiting on answers from you. What actually needs to be in it? Well, less than you might guess. First off, you should say who has final say on accepting or declining a sponsor or a business deal. How does sponsorship revenue get divided? And is that the same split as other revenue, or is it different? Since sponsorship work, brand deals often isn't distributed evenly between the hosts. What happens if someone can't deliver their part of a campaign, say recording an ad read or showing up for a branded segment after the deal's already been signed? And who's authorized to actually sign on behalf of the show on the business's end? Well, I worked with two co hosts a while back. I'll call them Priya and Sam. They'd been splitting their podcast revenue 50-50 since day one. No real conversation about it, just an assumption that felt fair. Then along comes a sponsor that offers a 6-month retainer deal. Biggest money this show's ever seen. And it involved a lot more work from Sam, who handled all the ad integration and the reporting and those kinds of things. Now, Priya assumed the split would stay the same 50-50 because everything always had. Sam figured it should shift because the workload shifted. Now, neither one was wrong, but neither one had ever written anything down. So there was no clear agreement to point to, just two reasonable people with two different and reasonable memories of an understanding that never actually existed. That conversation happened in the middle of this campaign as they were doing the deal, and that was the worst possible time to have that conversation. Everybody's under pressure, it's uncomfortable. Now, the second thing you need is your own sponsorship agreement, the actual contract that you would have with that brand or sponsor, drafted, ready to send, not just an idea in your head of what you want out of a deal or what you would accept. No, this is the piece that Jamie didn't have, and it's the one that creators skip over most often because it feels like something you build after you've got the deal, not before. But let me push back on that. A brand that's excited to work with you may not have their own paperwork ready either, especially if you are not maybe the first podcast partnership, but you're maybe one of the smaller ones. And so they say, send over your agreement. And that's a completely normal thing to hear from them. The creators who look most professional in that moment are the ones who already have something to send over. Here's what's changing when you are the one presenting the contract instead of just reacting. You set the exclusivity window instead of accepting whatever the brand proposes. You define how long they can use your name, likeness, or content after the campaign ends instead of discovering in perpetuity buried in someone else's document. You set the payment terms, your own terms, net 15 or net 30, not whatever a brand's finance department defaults to, instead of finding out 3 months later that the payment terms don't actually work the way you assumed they would. Having your own contract doesn't mean that every brand will sign it exactly as written, but it means that you're the one setting the starting terms of the conversation instead of only ever responding to someone else's. That is a meaningfully different position to negotiate from. A brand handing you a deal memo is working from a document written entirely in their own interest. But when you're the one who shows up with a clear, professionally drafted agreement already written up, you're not just protected, you look like a business the brand should want to keep doing business with. So what actually belongs in this agreement? Well, it's a handful of core terms, decided once, reused every time. Your exclusivity terms, how long and how narrowly defined? Are you willing to stay away from competing brands? Your usage rights, a defined window for how long that brand gets to use your name, voice, or content, not an open-ended one. Your payment terms and schedule spelled out plainly, since payment delays are one of the most common complaints that creators have about working with brands. And your deliverables described specifically enough that there is no ambiguity about what one integrated ad read actually means and what happens if the campaign falls through partway into the deal. Whether you keep a kill fee for work already delivered, for example. Now, none of this has to be adversarial. Most brands genuinely will work with reasonable terms if you're the one who shows up prepared. The problem isn't that brands are trying to take advantage of creators across the board. Some are more careless than they are predatory. The problem is that if you never draft your own terms, you're always negotiating from whatever the other side happened to write down first. The third piece is a basic piece of paperwork for anyone who appears on or contributes to the show in a way that could matter to a sponsor. That means guests, co creators, anyone whose name or voice or story becomes a part of an episode a brand wants to be associated with. Now, this is a bit lighter than the first two, but it matters more than people think, especially once an episode becomes valuable enough that the sponsor has attached their name to it specifically. Think about this from the brand side for a second. A sponsor isn't just buying an ad read, they are buying association with everything in that episode: the guest, the story, the credibility that comes with it. If that guest or talent later objects to how their appearance is used, or a co creator claims they never agreed to have their segment repurposed as paid promotion, well, that becomes the brand's problem too. And brands are naturally cautious about problems that aren't theirs to fix. So, a simple release agreement, permission to record, to publish, and permission to use the episode in ordinary promotion of the show closes that gap right up before it opens. It doesn't need to be complicated, it just needs to exist. And it needs to be signed before the mic gets turned on, not chased down after a sponsor asks about it. Now, here's where I want to be really direct with you. None of this needs to be complicated. This isn't about hiring a lawyer for every conversation with your co-host. It's about having three things settled in writing before you're in a position where the brand's paperwork is the thing forcing that conversation. A short, clear co-host agreement, your own sponsorship document, drafted and ready to send, and basic release language for anyone whose contribution matters and is a part of your show. That's the whole list. Now, if you're a podcaster specifically, this is one of the areas where my program, Easy Legal for Podcasters, can get you moving fast. It's a system built around exactly these kinds of foundational agreements, not just the copyrights and disclaimer basics that people usually think of first. So, what actually changes as you scale? Well, the stakes go up, but the questions really stay the same. A creator earning a few $100s from an affiliate link can get away with more informal understandings. A creator negotiating a 5 or 6-figure sponsorship campaign with a co host and a producer, well, they can't. The size of the deal doesn't create the risk, it just reveals whatever risk was already there, sitting unsettled under the surface. And here's the honest consequence of skipping this: it's usually not a lawsuit. It's something smaller and more common. The deal that stalls for a couple of weeks while you sort out some internal disagreements the sponsor should never have even seen. A renegotiation that happens after the fact from a weaker position because you're now trying to fix something instead of just confirming it. A co host relationship that gets tense right when it should be at its best because the money finally showed up and nobody agreed in advance on what happens next. There's a slower cost, too, one that's easy to miss. Brands talk to each other. Marketing managers move between companies. A show that takes 3 weeks to sort out basic internal questions before going to contract gets a quiet reputation as being a little more trouble than it might be worth. Not because anyone did anything wrong, just because it looked a little disorganized at exactly the moment it needed to look ready to go. Meanwhile, the show that was already had its terms sorted out and moves fast and looks professional tends to get asked back for the next campaign. Templates and do-it-yourself resources can absolutely get you started here. A lot of what I'm describing doesn't require custom legal work. It requires you to actually sit down, get some terms drafted before someone asks you for them. A solid starting template for a sponsorship agreement filled out with terms you've actually thought through always beats showing up with nothing. Where templates start to fall short is when your situation has something a generic form doesn't anticipate: unusual deliverables, or a multi-episode retainer, or a brand pushing back on terms in a way that calls for real negotiation. That's where when you've arrived at the point where I would tell you get real help. Not because do-it-yourself failed you, just that the deal in front of you is bigger or stranger than the templates were built for. The numbers might be big enough that getting the split wrong actually matters. Exclusivity or usage language you genuinely don't understand and don't want to take a guess at, or a disagreement with a partner that you just can't resolve on your own and you need someone neutral to help settle it in a way that'll actually hold up if it's ever tested. So here's a reframe for you. Don't wait for a brand to ask, do you have your own agreement? to figure out whether you're ready, sponsors are increasingly going to expect creators to show up prepared, not just enthusiastic. That's not going to change. What's in your control is whether you're the creator with a professional agreement ready to send the moment the brand says yes, or the creator who's scrambling to draft one from scratch while the momentum cools. Get the internal agreement with your partner settled. Get your own sponsorship agreement drafted and ready to send out. Make sure anyone whose name or story matters to an episode has actually agreed to how it gets used. That's what sponsor ready actually looks like, not just on camera, not just in your head, but on paper. And none of this has to happen this week, but it does have to happen before that brand deal comes along and they ask you to send it over. So I'm Gordon Firemark, and this has been Legit Podcast Pro. I will see you again next time when we'll talk more about some of the things you need to get ready for when you're in this podcasting business. See you real soon.